Hello Year 11, welcome to this homework video. We're going to look at the importance of the Berlin Wall, and in this video we're going to touch on Kennedy's speech at the wall, we'll look at the impact of the Berlin Wall on the Cold War, and then we'll do some practice at writing a narrative question. First of all, let's do some quick recap. As you know, by 1958 there was a refugee crisis in Berlin. Millions of East Germans were using Berlin as an escape route to the West. Khrushchev stepped in and issued an ultimatum to the West. He threatened them and told them that the Western powers had to leave West Berlin within 6 months. They refused to do so. A series of summits was then held between 1959 to 1961, but these summits failed to solve the crisis, and in the end they began to break down. Khrushchev decided to take matters into his own hands, so he closed the border and built a wall around West Berlin, and we know this as the Berlin Wall. In the short term, this wall led to a very tense standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. However, over the longer term, it settled the question of Berlin once and for all, and that reduced tensions between our superpowers. Both sides now accepted the division of the city. The new American president, John F. Kennedy, was keen to use the wall as a propaganda opportunity to embarrass the Soviet Union. So in 1963, he visited West Berlin. There he was greeted like a rock star. Thousands of West Berliners came out onto the streets to hear him speak. And stood beside the wall, he gave one of the most iconic propaganda speeches of the whole Cold War. It wasn't just West Berliners who listened to it. People on the Eastern Communist side of the city also listened in to the speech. So let's watch a couple of minutes from this iconic speech by Kennedy. Towards the end of the speech, you're going to hear a very famous phrase. It's a German phrase. Kennedy says, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Now, if we translate that, it means, "I am a Berliner." And you'll see that the crowd goes wild. Here it comes.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system, for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it, for it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, "Ich bin ein Berliner."
In the next activity, we're going to analyse some of the key phrases which Kennedy said in his speech. So you have a copy of an extract from his speech in task 1.13. I've picked out 3 phrases from the speech which are particularly important. I want you to read the speech and then to explain in your own words, what do you think these 3 quotes mean? What was Kennedy trying to say in those 3 quotes? You should pause the video now and do that, and then hit play when you're ready to move forward. So let's share some answers here. First of all, that first quote, I think Kennedy was trying to point out how unpopular communism was and how people preferred to live in a capitalist society. Quote 2 was trying to show that cooperation and compromise between the 2 superpowers was just not possible in Berlin or anywhere else in the world. And lastly, in quote 3, I think Kennedy was trying to make 2 points. First of all, he was pointing out that Berlin had become a symbol of freedom and democracy around the world. But secondly, to give a message of solidarity. In other words, he was trying to say that the West would stand by West Berlin and would never abandon it. Now let's look at task 1.12. We're going to think here about how the Berlin Wall changed some of the key features of the Cold War. So you actually have 5 key features of the Cold War, and I want you to think about how did the Berlin Wall change those. You're going to choose 2 of them and you're going to write a little explanation. I want you to use process words when you do that. These are words which describe how something changes or develops. So we're going to practice using those. Here's a model to get you started. I'm going to take A, the appeal of communism. The Berlin Wall actually reduced the appeal of communism. This is because it gave the impression that the USSR had to imprison people to make them stay. Furthermore, many people were shot and killed trying to escape over the wall, which made communism look brutal and damaged its reputation. Notice here that I've used one of those process words in my answer. Now, I don't want you to do A because we've done that already, but you get to choose 2 out of B, C, D and E, and I want you to explain how did the wall change those features. You need to pause and do that, and when you're done, hit play and we'll move forward. Okay, in the last part of your homework, we're going to take a look at a narrative question. You have this in your workbook. It's in task 1.14. Here's the question itself. Write a narrative account analysing the development of superpower rivalry over Berlin between 1958 and 1961. Now, the first thing to notice here is we're being asked to write a narrative account. Writing a narrative means telling the story, explaining how something developed over time. And we have to tell the story of how superpower rivalry over Berlin developed. So that's our focus. We also have a time frame, 1958 to 1961. We need to stick within that time frame and we need to cover all of it. Next, we need to plan our answer. Here's how to do it. I'm going to make a little timeline. I'm only going to put on here events which affected superpower rivalry over Berlin, because that's what the question asked me about. Above the line, I'm going to put events which increased the rivalry. Below the line, I'm going to put events which decreased it. We've already been given 2 events to put on our line by the examiner, and they will do this for you in the exam. So they'll give you 2 to work with. The refugee crisis is going above my line because that increased rivalry between the superpowers. Khrushchev was deeply unhappy that East Germans were using Berlin as an escape route to the West. The Berlin Wall I'm going to put this below my line. That decreased rivalry, because once the wall was built, it settled the question of Berlin for good. So what else could I include in my narrative? Well, I know that Khrushchev tried to solve the refugee crisis by issuing an ultimatum to the West. That raised tensions between the superpowers. Then the superpowers tried to solve those tensions and solve the question of Berlin. They did this by holding summits. 2 of those summits helped to decrease the rivalry. The Geneva Summit and the Camp David Summit went rather well, relatively. But then the following 2 summits went badly and rivalry increased. There was a spying row at the Paris Summit, and then at the Vienna Summit, Khrushchev tried to push the new young president around, and that led to the failure of the summit meeting. So now my timeline is ready. At this point, you need to pause and you need to add these events to your own copy of the timeline before we go any further. Now I'm nearly ready to write. Before I do, let's look at the model paragraph. You have a copy of it in your workbook. I'm going to ask you to pause now and read that for yourself. When you're done, hit play. So there are 3 things to notice here about this paragraph. Here they are. Firstly, because this is a narrative, we have to have our events in chronological order. So my story starts with the refugee crisis. Secondly, we need to use explaining connectives to link events together and to explain why they happened. There are lots of explaining connectives in this part of my answer. We also have process words here. These are words which explain how the superpower rivalry developed. When did it start? When did it increase? When did it decrease? When did it get more tense? And so on and so forth. Here are 2 of them. The superpower rivalry began and superpower rivalry reignited. Now, in this model paragraph, I've got up to the Berlin Ultimatum, which is where you're going to take over. Your job is to tell the rest of the story. In your workbook, you'll find you have a sentence starter. Your job is to complete this narrative. Remember, you need to use process words to explain how superpower rivalry developed, and you also need to have explaining connectives to link events and say why things happened. This is the last task in your homework. Good luck, and I'm looking forward to marking them.